Please welcome to the stage Dr. Eileen Serlin, Dr. Jennifer Kelly, Dr. Beth Romm-Reimer, and Dr. Florence Kaslow.
Good morning. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this panel. And I want to give a shout out and thank especially Division 32, Division of Humanistic Psychology, my home division, for sponsoring the panel and for having had the courage and a long history of confronting problems with diversity, racism, and difficult questions. And that brings us here today. I am Dr. Eileen Serlin. I'm a fellow of APA. I'm a past president of Division 32, council rep, and of the San Francisco Psychological Association as well. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all today. So personally, I thought of myself as a fairly international person. I am a folk dancer. I've traveled a lot, different cultures around the world. And I enjoyed meeting all kinds of people. And then, really shocked by what I began to observe as a very rapid race of anti-Semitism that really go with a lot of the rise of fascism, hatred, violence around the world. And then there was a particular moment, especially when the Kanye West situation happened, and there was an explosion around that I talked to my friends and colleagues here on this panel and said that I hope that we can do something about it. So I actually can't see that. I can't see the slides. So I do want to introduce the panelists here. We have Dr. Jennifer Kelly, who's a past president of the American Psychological Association, and she will continue introducing herself later. Dr. Beth Romm-Reimer, who is been on the board of APA and is the president of the Division for Prescription Privileges. And Dr. Florence Kaslow, who's in family practice. It's a long history of working with interfaith and other kinds of issues. So now, how do we advance it? How do we advance it? Excuse me? Aha. So the question is, what's at stake now? And we do see that there's so much rising violence around the world. We've had, as we talked about Kanye West, I think the larger sense of urgency for me has to do with challenges to democracy around the world. And this rising tide of hatred is really frightening, actually, for me. And also there's some of us have talked about a similarity with pre-World War II. And for me personally, Jews have often been the scapegoat for this, so that it's going to happen to one group and another and another. So then the question is, what can we here do as psychologists at APA? Some of the panelists will talk more about this in depth, but Jews and Blacks have a shared history, unfortunately, of trauma. We'll be talking about themes of from bondage to slave to freedom. And we also have some historical events in common. This image was taken on the same page of the newspaper, and it's in the news again now. The Tree of Life killings at the synagogue, and Kanye West is back again on Twitter, so it hasn't gone away. Again, we'll be hearing more about this later. We do have a history of shared working together, as well as conflicts, but we have a long history of having worked together. This says, it's a cartoon about solidarity. It says, can we join together? And the Nazis and the KKK have, so why shouldn't we unite? So the mission statements, if you can read them, I can't see them from here. These were made by mostly people of faith, and it also really brings in the question about where's the role of spirituality if we're going to be talking about healing. Very, very important. I take my stance at this moment on the stage as a psychologist, which is what I am. And so that really asks the question, what do we as psychologists know? What can we share? What are the problems, diagnosis, and treatment? What can we do within our own field and here and now at APA? So the psychological symptoms, we've all seen them all over: alienation, despair, teenage suicides, and certain mechanisms that we know about. We know about splitting and denial, projection. We know about those kinds of things. So in terms of where we might start, we know that actually the first steps are just to find our own voices. That is our identity, our personal, our collective voices. We tell our stories. That has been going on throughout this convention, and the panelists will tell their stories. We share with others, which is what we're doing here on the stage today, and we try to learn better to listen. So the presenters, as you can see here are the titles, and one at a time they will come up, share their stories and their perspectives on this. We'll have a little time for question A, and we have a surprise ending for you all. So welcome please to my friends, colleagues, and panelists on this panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So what I want to do is spend just a little time. We have about 10 minutes each. And I want to give some historical perspectives about the relationship between the blacks and the Jews, but I also want to give my historical perspective before we do that. And so I want to start talking about the milestones of the Black American experience. And it's a long, winding road. And I was looking at some of the, what are some of the landmarks in terms of the things that really help to shape where we are right now. And I would say that my conscious world started with Jim Crow. So I was born in the segregated South and was raised there and we integrated during my junior school years. So my history is like many others' histories, my Black American friends and colleagues here. But if we are a product of our experiences, our history, our ancestors, it really goes back to slavery. So those are the things that shape us in the way we see the world, the way we think, and our experiences. So my experience goes back to slavery, and you look at the Civil War and Emancipation, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, where we had some of the most deplorable conditions and separate and definitely unequal. And I think that most of my family left to look for a better life. They left the Deep South to have a better world. And in many cases, they had conditions that were just as deplorable as they were in the Deep South. And then the next big milestone was the Civil Rights Movement. And we saw integration and the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And I fast forward to 2020, where we really saw the Black Lives Matter movement. And guess what? Most recently, we have Jim Crow 2.0. The Supreme Court reverses affirmative action in colleges. And I will say to you that I stand before you today because of affirmative action. I am not mistaken about why I'm here. And it's not because of affirmative action that they said, let's admit Jennifer Kelly because she's a black person and we need to have a black person, but they did not deny me admission to the schools because I was a black person. And that's what affirmative action means to me. And I've been deeply troubled by what's been happening with Jim Crow 2.0. So when I think about the black-Jewish relations in America, I know that it's a complex relationship. And there's conflict and there's cooperation. And so you can't just smooth over and say that nothing happened because there's a history there. And that helped to shape where we are right now. So we do know that there was some Jewish slaveholders. And they say that the numbers were small. As far as I'm concerned, if we had one slaveholder, that's one too many. But we know that there's a history with that. And we know that there's a rise in anti-Semitism, and then that's including in parts of the black community. And they have the blacks have accused the Jews of being over-aggressive in their business practices and relations with blacks and economically oppressing blacks. And recently we've had several prominent black athletes and other entertainers have come out and made anti-Semitic statements and posted them on social media. Most recently, Edward Blum, who's a Jewish American, worked for years and years, you can look it up, to overturn affirmative action and won. So those are some of the conflicts that we have in our relationships. But there's also cooperation. So the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust and what we've had with Jim Crow led the two communities to unite and advocate for each other. And the relationships that were developed during the first half of the 20th century created the foundation for significant partnerships. In addition to those conflicts, we had the partnerships between the two communities during the Civil Rights Movement. And the two groups, the leaders of those groups worked jointly to launch a movement for racial equality in the United States. So I put this together. And so I am in Atlanta, Georgia, and I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi, so I was really entrenched, and my family was entrenched with the Civil Rights Movement. And look at this is what I see here that was so important. And I look at that middle picture. That was in 1963 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And you had these three civil rights workers, two Jewish Americans, one black American. They were killed because of civil rights, that people needed to be treated equally. And then you can just see the relationships that we've had together, our two groups, and working together to really try to make a change in this world and overturn something that really needed to change. So after the Civil War, the Jewish shop owners and landlords engaged in business practices with many of the blacks, and including my family. And we knew that if we could go to the shops that were owned by the Jewish owners, that we would be treated with dignity and respect, and my family did that. And religious leaders such as the rabbis and the ministers of the Black Baptist churches frequently worked with each other and played key roles in the Civil Rights Movement. And what happened was that the Klan exploited this. And what we saw was a rise of the bombings of the Jewish, the temples and the communal gatherings. In 1957 in Atlanta, Georgia, the temple, which I go and worship at on occasion, was bombed because of the work that the temple did in working with the blacks during the Civil Rights Movement. So what happened was our work together ended up resulting in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson in 65. And it did things like abrogated poll taxes, literacy tests, and other bureaucratic restrictions. But one of the things that was important about that to me, and what was symbolic, is that it was drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center. And that educates and mobilizes the Reformed Jewish communities on legislative and social concerns of Reformed Judaism. And it is housed the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. So you can see that it wasn't just outward, but it was also internal work that the groups did together. So what's next? So we know we've had the conflict, we got the cooperation. What's next for us? So what I'm really excited about was in 2019, there was a bipartisan group of Congress members. They announced the formation of the Congressional Caucus of Black-Jewish Relations, and with the hopes of strengthening the trust and advancing our issues in a collective manner. So every year, this is my personal piece of this, every year on the birth date of Martin Luther King, his holiday, on that Friday evening, Ebenezer Baptist Church, which Reverend Warnock, it was Martin Luther King's church, now Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock, they would worship together at the temple on a Friday evening. On that Sunday, they would worship at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And they would have a combined choir, and they celebrate the work that they did together and how we can have continued work together. One of the things that we have to look at is the intersectional identity. So we have a growing number of Black Jews and Jews of color in the United States, and I have a niece and a nephew who are Black Jews. And it's really helped having the Jewish communities to reevaluate their approaches to inclusion. Who do you decide is Jewish, and how do you integrate them into your community? But we do know that the schools need to teach about the history of racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of bigotry in the United States with a focus on moving forward. Thank you.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyimanu v'higiyimanu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, our Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life and sustained us and allowed us to arrive at this time. Because I'm standing here with my erudite colleagues and discussing the critical importance of our collaborative work to root out racial, ethnic, religious, LGBTQ+, gender-related persecution, hate, and violence, I thought it was fitting to recite the Shehechianu prayer. As a young girl, sitting at my grandmother's feet, I heard about the friendly, those slithery snakes and raucous pigs, the welcoming neighing of the horses, and the cool summer nights that my grandmother spent sleeping in the barn in the hay with the animals. There were also the emergency visits to the doctor, miles away by horse and carriage. And then the frightening shouts of the men on horseback coming ever closer, threatening to burn the farms that provided a sharecropper's farm, home and work for my grandmother's family and other Jewish families, fortunate to have felt a stability in the western region of Russia, the Pale of Settlement, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Soon enough, my great-grandfather in 1907 left his home and his family in Russia to build a new life for them in America. On November 11th, 1911, my grandmother, who was then just 13 years old, arrived at Ellis Island with her mother and 3 younger siblings, homesick for her rural life in Ukraine, and anxious but hopeful about the architecture of her future life as the family would soon reunite on the Lower East Side of New York City. From my grandmother and my grandfather, my mother and my father, and my large extended family, I learned about the Jewish ideals of a loving commitment to family and to social justice in our larger society. Rabbi Hillel's 2,000-year-old poetic maxim, if I'm not for myself, who will be? If I'm for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when? This was the foundation of who we were as Jews in 20th century America. Historians have traditionally divided American Jewish immigration into 3 periods: Sephardic, German, and Eastern European. Sephardic Jews from Portugal, Spain, Brazil, and the Middle East, some of whose families had escaped the Spanish Inquisition, came to the New World in the 1700s and 1800s. German Jews began to come to America in significant numbers in the 1840s. Some 250,000 German-speaking Jews came to America by the outbreak of World War I. Eastern European Jews began to immigrate to the United States in large numbers after 1880, pushed out of Europe by overpopulation, oppressive legislation, poverty, and murderous pogroms. They were pulled toward America by the compelling narratives of a life with opportunity and freedom from ethnic violence. Between 1880 and the onset of restrictive immigration quotas in 1924, over 2 million Jews from Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Romania came to America. Pogroms continued in Eastern and Western Europe throughout the first half of the 20th century, culminating in the Holocaust, although not ending with the Holocaust. And that was, of course, the systematic government-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews and other ethnic groups. 2 out of every 3 European Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Fully 1/3 of world Jewry was exterminated. 90% of Poland's 3.3 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust between 1939 and 1945. In the United States, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Jews and African Americans actively worked together in the labor movement, pressing for improved working conditions and equitable pay. My maternal grandfather was a labor leader. In the immediate post-World War II period, the Jewish Labor Committee, founded in February 1934 to oppose the rise of Nazism in Germany, formed approximately 24 local committees to combat racial intolerance in the United States and Canada. The JLC helped found the United Farm Workers and campaigned for the passage of California's Fair Employment Practices Act and provided staffing and support for the 1963 March on Washington led by Martin Luther King. Jewish Americans partnered with African Americans in the South in the 1950s and early 1960s to register Black voters, and together suffered violent backlash. This partnership peaked with the passage of the critical civil rights legislation in 64, 65, and 68. Over the decades, there have been setbacks in Black-Jewish relations. African American leaders have accused Jews of racist practices in labor unions, in neighborhood businesses, and the music business. Jewish leaders have accused Black religious, intellectual, and political leaders of unabashed anti-Semitism. But Jewish communities and African American communities have achieved much together and celebrate deep-rooted bonds. There was great rejoicing in both communities with the ascension to the presidency of Barack Obama. Isabel Wilkerson has discussed in her recent book, Cast the Parallels between the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany and the treatment of African Americans in the United States. The Anti-Defamation League formed the Black-Jewish Alliance in 2017 to galvanize Black communities and Jewish communities to fight racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of persecution and hate. Freedom Seders are celebrated together with African American and Jewish friends and neighbors. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, an African American man, on June 23rd, announced the creation of New York City's first Jewish Advisory Council. He said, "Our Jewish community, the largest in the world outside of Israel, is a critical part of New York City. With anti-Semitic crimes up across the nation, our Jewish Advisory Council will ensure that Jewish New Yorkers in every community have access to the support and resources the city offers." In 1958, when Martin Luther King was invited to address the American Jewish Committee Convention, he intoned, "My people were brought to America in chains. Your people were forced to come here to escape the chains that suffocated them in Europe. Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility. There are Hitlers loose in America today," he continued, "both in high and low places. As the tensions and bewilderment of economic problems become more severe, history's scapegoats, the Jews, will be joined by new scapegoats, the Negroes." And in his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, King wrote, "Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. The Bible tells the thrilling story of how Moses stood in the Pharaoh's court centuries ago and cried, 'Let my people go.' This is a kind of opening chapter," he said, "in a continuing story." On the first anniversary of Martin Luther King's birthday in 1969, after he'd been tragically assassinated on April April 4th, 1968, I joined the vast majority of my high school classmates who were predominantly Jewish in a walkout of our school. On this first anniversary, we were determined to commemorate King's life and his enormous contributions to our society by not attending school as usual, but walking en masse down to the town's community center, renaming it the Martin Luther King Jr. Center, and holding sing-ins and animated conversations about how we, Jewish and African American students together, were going to work to end racism and poverty and achieve peace among nations, retaining the idealism of my youth and continuing to live out the tenets of Rabbi Hillel's wise words. And as we face the scourge of virulent hatred today in our country and around the world, I look forward to continuing my work in our APA with my multiracial, diverse colleagues to root out racism, anti-Semitism, LGBTQ+ persecution, pernicious sexism and misogyny. APA and our country's democracy is the richer because of its diversity, its broad array of opinions and lifestyles. If not now, when?
Welcome and thank you all for attending this session. The lighting is such that we can't see you, and I wish we could so we could feel more connected. My presentation is a little different because I'm talking about comprehending and combating anti-Semitism, racism, and anti-ethnic prejudice, a brief biographical account. Growing up in a Jewish, growing up Jewish in a non-Jewish community and going to an elementary school where my sister and I were among the half dozen Jewish students there, exposed us very early in our lives to overt prejudice, like being called dirty Jew or being the only girls in our classes not to invite somebody's birthday party. It was not unusual for our family to come home from Friday night services at our synagogue and find a swastika painted on our house, or my parents' adjoining grocery store. How unnerving and distressing. Being different wasn't tolerated well, and the police would not get involved. My parents stressed that we had to be good students, go to the library, and excel in school. We both did, and that probably antagonized our classmates more. The importance of a good education was a major value in both of my parents' families. My dad had immigrated with much of his family from Russia, and they all believed in a good education as the way to get ahead. When I graduated at the age of 16, I started college at Temple University in Philadelphia. I took a bus and the subway, and it was not a fancy college, but one of the things that was wonderful is many of the students were returning GIs who had learned to appreciate and take care of each other no matter their backgrounds. I had to work, and so I got a part-time job at the Philadelphia Fellowship Commission and worked there for the Jewish Community Relations Council. It was wonderful to be in a collaborative, mutually respectful, interreligious, and interracial environment. When I went to Temple, I was asked to represent Hillel, the Jewish Student Foundation, on the Interfaith Council, and did so. Again, I valued this intergroup collaboration and exchange. Later, when I went to graduate school at Ohio State University, I decided to live at the International House. There were 16 residents, and I was one of only 2 white American residents, and we were to play hostess to the other women from other countries. That was fun because when the Indian girls went to a party, they dressed me in a sari and put on a bindi. And when I went with the Latin American girls, I wore Latin American clothes and learned all the dances. Decades later, I was instrumental in setting up the International Family Therapy Association and was its first president. The first meeting was in Prague, and at the end of the meeting, people came over to me and said, "We need to have international conferences every year." And so we did. And about the 3rd year, one of my colleagues from Israel said, "Would you be interested in setting up a Holocaust dialogue group between survivors of the Germans, of the Nazis, and of Jewish families?" And I thought about it and thought, this is a wonderful idea. It's time that we begin the process of healing. And we went to our colleagues from Hungary, where the next event was going to be, and they said, yes, we could do it. However, the participants, which I limited to 25, would have to be 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Hungarian, 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 German or Austrian, and 1/3 of the groups had to be from Hungary, because what they were finding is that many of them had been raised as non-Jewish, and as they grew up, they found out that they were actually born Jewish, and that had to be hidden for them to survive. That formula continued throughout 10 years in different countries. At the first session, I had everybody introduce themselves. And as they went around, I had often lectured in Germany, and my Jewish colleagues wanted to know why. And I said, because I felt the healing had to begin. We couldn't go on hating and fearing each other. And one German couple who were there, when it was their turn to introduce themselves, stood up and started crying and shaking and saying, "We don't know whether or not you can accept us. How can we apologize and help set things right?" And they were crying, and I went over, despite the fact that we're not supposed to touch people. I felt it was all right in the group setting. And I held them as they apologized for themselves and their families of origin. And they trusted me because they had been in sessions I had done in Germany. Some of the Jewish people there said, "We don't know if we can sit through this. These are the people whose parents killed our relatives." What was interesting over the 10-year period is some of them became friends, or certainly at least colleagues that could work together across countries. One of the things that was interesting is that the Shoah Foundation called me as they had heard about this program, and they wanted to know if they could film one of our sessions. And much to my own regret, I had to say no because the promise we made each year at the beginning of the session was that who was there and what they said was confidential, and I couldn't violate that promise. It was a great opportunity and very tempting, but it couldn't be done. Unfortunately, the current crest of rising anti-Semitism is gaining strength, and many fear another Holocaust could be brewing. This is one of the compelling reasons why some of us here are involved now in Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism. If anyone's interested, please see me afterwards. We must help shatter the forces and people perpetuating this and any kind of racism or ethnic hatred. We cannot control what others think and feel, but we can and must band together and educate and legislate against hatred, prejudice, and vilification of those who look and behave differently. We shall and must overcome together. Thank you.
Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. We are jointly survivors of intergenerational trauma, of historical trauma, and yet we made it. As one Jewish sister shared in the documentary, The Journey Home, the ways in which we survived were not always beautiful, but we survived. And I think we can say that for both of our communities. The ways in which we have survived has shown the effects of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, have shown the impact of oppression, but collectively we are able to eradicate it and dismantle it by working in solidarity. And so I want to thank my sisters for working together to put together this panel. I'm so glad that each of you came, and I'm going to talk about solutions for just a few moments from the perspective of womanist psychology. Womanist psychology is born out of the wisdom and experience of Black women. Audre Lorde, a Black poet, said, "When we speak, we are afraid. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So we might as well speak, knowing we were never meant to survive." And we recognize that our voices have power and that we have agency. And so a key component of womanist psychology is that we define ourselves. We recognize that the oppression that our communities have experienced show up in many ways. Racism and anti-Semitism are not merely bias. People like that word bias because it feels palatable, it's comfortable. We can say everybody has bias. What can we do about that? It's just individual attitudes. But anti-Semitism and racism are structural. They are systemic. They are institutional. They are unescapable. They show up in every system. And this is important because when we just think about them as individual biases, people will say, well, you should just avoid people who don't like you. How can we avoid anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism when it shows up in the education system, in the economic system, in housing, in media, in banking, in healthcare? It shows up in our histories of enslavement, colonialism, and Holocaust. And it's important that we recognize these experiences are not just historical, but as my colleagues have shared, they are ongoing and contemporary. And so as we navigate these colonized systems, as we navigate the realities of oppression, we have to also be mindful of internalized oppression. What are the ways that we have been taught to hate ourselves, to despise ourselves, to try to hide our own identities? Because the impact of these realities also keep us from working in solidarity. And the impact of oppression create for us a scarcity mentality where we start operating in competition, thinking that if one of our issues are named and addressed, then there will be no room for the other issues. But instead, we recognize that we have more power when we work collectively. So those effects show up, and we can reflect within ourselves, in our family, in our communities, the ways in which we have seen anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism create within us depression and anxiety, rage and numbness. We have seen how some of us try to cope with our humor. We have seen the ways in which it changes our behavior toward each other and even within our communities. We see how it affects our trust and distrust, how it shows up in our bodies, where some of our community members say, it doesn't bother me, and yet we have migraines and nausea and backache and insomnia and grind our teeth, and it is showing up in our skin and in our hair because the stress of oppression is real. It even shows up for us spiritually, for many people having a loss of faith, a transformation of faith, or an increase in their faith. And the harms of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism create physical health consequences. So in womanist psychology, some wisdom we can collectively share is the importance of self-definition. We will not allow other people to define us. We will not operate in constant reaction to other people's assumptions and stereotypes. It's a full-time job trying to combat stereotypes. I remember a senior Black woman who was trying to help me to survive said to me that if she was me, she wouldn't smile so much because people don't take Black people seriously. Well, if I have to mean mug everybody I see because I'm worried about what you think about Black people, I will never be able to be myself. So we have to operate with that clarity of who we are. We have to work on our emotional healing so we don't bleed on each other. Yes, we have been wounded, but we don't want to harm each other. We also recognize from womanist psychology the importance of not just symptom cessation, so not just alleviating distress, but that we want to think about liberation. In other words, we're not just looking to combat oppression, but we want to awaken our imaginations. What will it look like when Jewish people and Black people live from a liberated state? And when we consider that post-traumatic growth, that we cultivate destiny and joy and wholeness, recognizing that it will not be enough for us just to cope. We are not encouraging our communities to medicate their pain, but for us to have resistant strategies. And that means we recognize that if I stand up and speak up, as our foreparents did, that there are costs, but we're willing to pay the costs. That we will not hide behind professionalism that says to be a psychologist, I have to be neutral and mute and not seem passionate. I tell people very clearly, my interest in racism is not a mere matter of intellectual curiosity. I am moved by it. And you who have gathered to work against anti-Semitism, I am sure it is not just because it is intellectually stimulating, but because we recognize our community's lives are on the line. And so we want to extend our ways of knowing. We want to show up with love and compassion. We want to operate in balance and flexibility. And I will give you the proverb that I created. She who is flexible is not easily stressed out. And so we have to learn how to adjust when we are taken by surprise by the realities of oppression. We raise our consciousness so we recognize anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and other forms of oppression when they show up. We connect with each other, we heal with our hearts, and we engage with our voices. We work actively to resist and to dismantle. I am so glad for our scripture reading that was shared in the Jewish tradition, and I will share in the African tradition the greeting, the Zulu greeting, Sawubona, I see you. And as long as we see each other, we can shift the tide. Thank you so much.
We have a little surprise for the ending. So we're going to close by singing a hymn together. The words will be on the screen. Go Down Moses. And first of all, I would like to invite Simi Romreimer, who's going to lead us in a call and response. So you will see the words on the screen, Simi, and then we respond. Simi, and then we respond. And finally, if we can all stand up, since we've been sitting. So I invite you all to stand. And we're going to link arms if you would like. So you can you see from there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. So Moses went to Egypt's land, let my people go. He made old Pharaoh understand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
Thank you so much for coming.